What's up, guys? It's Derp here. Wanted to get into this Dark and Darker situation because a lot of people are kind of spreading some unsubstantiated claims. A lot of people are talking like they know what's up, but a lot of it's opinion. A lot of this right now is speculation. I kind of wanted to get a video with what we know as fact and what is unsubstantiated. I wanted people to know without really any personal bias, as little personal bias in it as possible, what's going on. So they can make their own opinions. They could think of their own judgment. I'm going to add some of my own comments and opinion in it later. Uh, but I wanted to kind of cut the fat, right? This video is going to be a little bit longer. And full disclosure, I am a hardcore Dark and Darker stan. I love Dark and Darker. I spent a ton of hours in playtest 4. Uh, Basically, no life the game the entire time that it was up. Plan on making it my game that I make content about, making it my full-time game for myself. I love that game. Can't wait for it to come out. If you watched my last video before all this stuff even happened, I talk about how I quit New World to play Dark and Darker. I wanted to make this video to kind of help some people see through what's true and what's not. Because it took me a lot of time. Once I got wind that Dark and Darker might be shut down or their playtest might be pushed back or whatever, the rumor mill kind of churned up, I said, okay, well, what is actually going on? And I started reading a bunch of websites that I had to translate from Korean into English, started reading case law from Korean that's in Korean. I started reading, the Trade Secrets Act from in Korean. I read through most of it. Didn't read it entirely because at some point it stops to be relevant to this case. But I read a lot of it, and then because of that they cite other articles and other laws, so I read those too. So a lot of this is kind of up in the air, and I wanted to do my own research. And what I found is that, as usual, nobody on Discord or Reddit knows what the hell they're talking about and what's real. What Nexon and IronMace have both said that is, in line with each other, which one is different, what the police have said that is true, and evidence from both sides. I wanted to take a look at all of it and kind of just let everybody else make their own opinions. I have my opinions and possible outcomes at the end of the video. But yeah, in my opinion, has very, very far reaching implications in gaming as a whole. There's two situations here. There is one situation with Nexon's attempt to copyright entire class mechanics and naming conventions and how that impacts IronMace. And then there's the case of the Trade Secret Act litigation that's going on between. There's two cases with that. The Trade Secret Act is being implemented against Mr. Choi himself and against IronMace. That's how they got the investigation and raid into the IronMace studios. But I'll get into that later. It's going to be in the timeline. So this may impact me because I have used some of the files that they have used from the asset pack to make my own. I'm making my own game, and I've used some similar files. I have some of the exact same file names in my game, but that won't really impact me. But the class, I use similar class naming systems, right? They all come from Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast and Tolkien, and it's been in lore, it's been in the canon of fantasy and medieval fantasy and Western fantasy for decades. So this impacts me, it impacts every other developer. It can impact the way that this plays out is basically going to shape the future of indie game development and game development in general for AAA studios, indie game development, and has far-reaching. It might have far-reaching implications. I don't want to sensationalize it, but yeah, let's just get into the timeline. This whole case revolves around Mr. Choi. During COVID, a lot of people are working remotely from home. So according to a Discord announcement in the IronMace and Dark and Darker Discord, Mr. Choi, in the beginning of COVID, gets permission to host a server with all the P3 work files on it, right? He is the lead developer on a project called P3, which looks extremely similar to Dark and Darker. anyone from the outside looking in might say that it was the precursor to Dark and Darker, right? Some of the mechanics were similar, the art style similar for a reason, for several reasons actually. The art style similar, the gameplay mechanics are kind of similar, classes are similar with similar naming conventions. There's a lot of it that's similar. Like, that's all warranted. Nexon is not lying when they say that P3 is strikingly similar to Dark and Darker. I'll add my opinion to that later. But according to Mr. Choi, he gets permission from Nexon to host a server at his house. This is an important part of the timeline. And so is the fact that they give him permission. So this is going to impact the trade secrets case that they have later. This is completely unsubstantiated, all hearsay from IronMace. We don't know if this is true or not. Nexon has not substantiated this. They have not came out and said, hey, this is true. There's no records and police investigations that says anything about this. This is all just from the word, on the word of IronMace. So take it for what you will. Sometime in 2021, Mr. Choi is told to take the servers down. And that part is true. Nexon has spoken what they have basically said the same thing. At some point in 2021, they told Mr. Choi to take down the servers, his personal servers for the P3 project. According to him and IronMace, he agrees. That last part is completely unsubstantiated. We don't know if he agreed. We don't know what transpired. That's also from the same Discord announcement that I will go over later. Sometime in 2021, Mr. Choi is asked if he can keep the backup server running in case they are asked to work from home again. So earlier, when they asked him to take the servers down, they go to work remote. They ask Mr. Choi to start up his own server so they can keep working on P3. Mr. Choi says okay. They're told to go back into office and that Mr. Choi needs to take his servers down. He says okay. But then he asks, hey, COVID's still going on. Can I keep this kind of running in sleep mode so I can start it back up later? According to him, he never receives a response. They kind of ghost him because the server's still up and it's still connected to Nexon servers. They can see that there's still a script running in the background to keep that access to that server active. And he says that it passes security, and they never tell him that he has to take it down again. So he decides, unfortunately, to keep that server running. We know that part of this is true. We know that he, in fact, didn't take the server down, or not in fact, but according to him and Nexon, some form of the server is still running that he has access to. Most of that is unsubstantiated except for that last part. And that is important because this is later why he is fired. And this is exactly how his pending trade secrets case is even allowed. Because there's a lot of legal loopholes you have to do in Korea to fire somebody, but I'll get into that later. So this part is super, super important. This part will be decided in court. The beginning part where if they responded to him or not, or he gave warning that it was still up, and if he actually asked to keep it running, that's going to be more important for him on a personal level when he does go to court for this. For IronMace, it's not as important. For is P3 going to die or not, might not be as important. Sometime between that happening and around May of 2021, P3 is slated to be transferred to a subsidiary company. They have several subsidiary companies. Nexon says, hey, they tell Mr. Choi, hey, we're going to move P3 to a subsidiary. This has been confirmed by Nexon. They say that they wanted to transfer it to one of their subsidiaries. They named that subsidiary, but I can't remember what their name is. So they say their plan was to transfer it to a subsidiary and then restart the project without this development team, or with some of the development team no longer working on it. Mr. Choi, according to him and that same Discord announcement, at this time in June of 2021, begins the process of leaving Nexon. He's going to quit. So Mr. Choi is going to quit. He says that there was harsh working conditions. The projects were being canceled or transferred to subsidiaries all over the place, and it seemed like Nexon, was doing some shady stuff, according to him. This is all completely unsubstantiated. We don't know. What we do know is that Nexon somehow got word that he was leaving. So, and it's probably because Mr. Choi, in my opinion, did something kind of dumb, and he informed his entire team at P3 that he's leaving, and that he wants to work on a project similar to P3. And he says explicitly in their Discord, according to the Discord announcement, that he tells the whole team that we're going to be starting from scratch, but I want to make a game like P3. And at this point, they've already built half of it, right? So they already know how to build the stuff. They probably have a rough outline of what they want the map to look like. Maybe improve stuff that they worked on in P3 because they're going to be under their own direction. Kind of take what they already built and then improve upon it and get it out to the public as fast as possible. So he tells his team that he plans on leaving to start his own studio. This part is confirmed by Nexon and is part of their pending lawsuit. Super, super, super important because this is kind of a no-no. If he told the team that he wants to use any ideas that they had while working at Nexon, it can be used against him later in the Trade Secrets Act lawsuit. So this is super, super important. Exactly what he said, we have no idea. That's unsubstantiated. But he did say something, and this is most likely why they actually fired him. According to them, it's because he kept the server up and stole stuff. But in my opinion, that doesn't really hold water, and the fact that he was leaving to start his own studio using knowledge, whether it's direct assets or not, he's still gotten this knowledge while working at Nexon. Using that knowledge could fall under the Trade Secrets Act, because it works a lot differently than it does in the U.S. Now, as I was just saying, end of July, Nexon finds out about this about Mr. Choi leaving to work on a project similar to P3. Nexon files for an investigation under the Trade Secrets Act, and they find out that his personal server is still running because he told them, right? And it has at least some of the P3 files on it. This is all confirmed by Nexon, and, well, not really confirmed, it's all kind of substantiated between Nexon, the legal case, and IronMace themselves. So this is where they file for the Trade Secrets Act, and that's also why they fire him, right? The only way that you can really fire people in Korea is if you have some kind of proof that they can either harm you, they can cause the business to lose profits, they are in some kind of danger to their employees or the company itself. There's only certain circumstances that you can actually fire people for in Korea, and it's pretty strict. But I'll get into that later. So after they find that his personal server is still running with at least some of the P3 files on it, he's canned. He claims that it was just running a background script and he was keeping the project open in case he needed to work on it from home again. And then in August 5th of 2021, P3 is announced. They announce it publicly, which is also super, super important. So P3 is announced publicly. And it's announced two places. It's announced at Gematsu, and then another right here, Donga. So as you can see, Project P3 is right here on the front page of a Korean gaming news outlet, Gematsu, and this is from August 5th, 2021 at 2:45 a.m. So it's pretty plain to see that they publicly announced P3 is trying to say that this is a leak, but But there's a video on right here where they're talking with somebody from Nexon about these upcoming games, and here is Project P3 again, right here. So it wasn't leaked. It was for sure, unequivocally announced. They announced this game. It's as simple as that. In my opinion, any kind of argument against it being announced on August 25th or before is going to get thrown out immediately if it's in any kind of court that actually finds this evidence, right? So they announced, this is super important because of how the Trade Secrets Act actually works. So shortly after this announcement, Cho was actually fired for under the Trade Secrets Act. As best as I can tell, the timeline is sometime after the announcement of P3, Mr. Choi is fired. This is confirmed by Nexon and the investigation under the Trade Secrets Act. On October 21st, 2021, IronMace is founded. And during that time, Mr. Choi, he takes 9 members from the P3 team. And 9 people decide to follow Mr. Choi and the other founder of IronMace out of a successful career at Nexon, where they have union status and are probably paid pretty well. And they decide to leave it for a startup to make a game similar to the one that they were working on under Nexon. So to me, this is kind of where I start to buy Mr. Cho's story. Doesn't matter what he said. What matters is the action of people and other people who were there. Why would these 9 people up and leave their comfy job with a union if it wasn't for the fact that Nexon was doing something shady, right? And if they were being pulled off of all their projects. Essentially, what it sounds like to me is that Nexon was breaking up their team and taking them off of the project. And Nexon themselves have confirmed that they were going to offload that project. And Mr. Choi knew about this way in advance. So to me, this seems like Mr. Choi told these members, hey, they're going to cut you out of this project and they're going to offload it. So why don't we keep working on a project similar to this and let's start our own game company? And they were like, heck yeah, let's do it, because they all actually cared about the game. So they found IronMace on sometime in October 2021. That's also when development starts beginning on Dark and Darker, well after the initial announcement of P3. Now, in September 7th, 2022, the first public playtest of Dark and Darker happens, according to the Steam changelogs and what I was looking through. I don't know if that's the first one or the second, but this is the first actually updated changelog of Dark and Darker through Steam, other than them making their Steam profile. So unless they had a private playtest, the first Steam playtest happened on September 7th, 2022. Now, in February 6th through 16th, IronMace has their 4th playtest and hits 2 million active accounts. 2 million active accounts by February 26th. So between that time, between October of 2021 and September 7th, 2022, they basically have the game in a vertical slice playable demo state. And then by February 6th, they have 2 million active users, which, if you couple that with the price point that that IronMace publicly released of anywhere between $20 to $40, that's anywhere from, I don't know, $40 to $80 million for just once they hit early access. If all of those players get early access, that's a lot of money. And IronMace, and then Nexon, almost immediately after that playtest and seeing those player numbers, on February 9th of 2023, Nexon files for copyrights for P3. It's confirmed. And it's not just normal copyrights. I'll get into that later, because these copyrights, this is super, super important. These copyrights are actually what scare me the most. I love Dark and Darker, but if these copyrights actually go through, a lot of stuff can get screwy real quick. And then in March 2023, Nexon files for Trade Secrets Act investigation under IronMace. March 7th, there's the police raid on IronMace, which kind of started my investigation of all this whole thing. And then March 22nd, 2023, there's the DMCA takedown, and it goes, to the point where Dark and Darker is delisted from Steam. Now, we get a lot more information, a lot of it unsubstantiated, from this Discord announcement on March 26th, 2023. So here's what I think is important. This is kind of important information that we all need to think about now that we have the timeline. What do we need to draw from that timeline that is actually important? First and foremost, Korean law is based on civil law. It's kind of, if you relate it to like Dungeons and Dragons, it's rules as written. For a lot of the people in the US, we're more familiar with common law. US law is common law. It's more rules as interpreted by the judge, or it's judged by precedent. If a similar case has already been tried, you usually go on precedent. And if it's a case that hasn't been tried before, which is rare, it's up to the interpretation of the judge and a jury if that's applicable, right? So it's all about the judge and the jury and how they apply legal statute to the case in front of them, right? It's more of a decision based on the individual versus, hey, no, this is the rule as written. We follow this rule. If there's no ruling on this and we feel that there should be one, we'll make a law about it, right? At least to the best of my knowledge, that's how Korean law works. But what I do read a lot of places, and what has been substantiated by people from Korea that I've talked to, I have author friends and stuff that live in Korea, and I've reached out to them like, hey, how does this work? And they kind of told me, labor law is super strict. Law in general is super strict in Korea. Like, they're very by the book to the letter of the law over there. I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, so this is all kind of secondhand knowledge to me through other people and through what I've read. But what I did read is that the Labor Standard Act makes it illegal for companies to hire without a written contract. Everybody who's hired anywhere needs some form of written contract that kind of outlines the terms of employment, like, very clearly, where both parties can understand. Everybody knows what they're signing into. Both parties sign it. They have to sign these contracts. I have right here. Where is that? Let me pull it up. Yeah, Labor Standards Act. So I read through this, looked it up. Labor Standards Act, Enforcement of Rules, Labor Standards Act. It's all in here. But I'm gonna try to get these all in a Google document and put the links in my description. But the Labor Standard Act makes it illegal for companies to hire without written contract. It also makes it illegal for employees or employers to fire people or break the contract without proof that the employee may damage the company's reputation, profit, or cause other form of harm to the company or other employees. Kind of little loose facts that also play into this here. 15% of the entire Korean labor market falls under a labor union federation. So there's a big group of labor unions. There's actually two of them that join forces, and they make up this giant federation of labor unions. It's basically one massive labor union. There's two of them. So these two massive labor unions that kind of cover there's one for the public sector and one for the government, right? And then those kind of branch out into other smaller unions. And it just so happens that the Nexon development team, almost all of the members from the Nexon development team, are members of a labor union called the Starting Point Labor Union. And it makes these people extremely difficult to be fired. They basically have to break the law, actually break a serious law, or be seen as some kind of threat to the company or other employees. So it makes it's just super hard to fire people. Nexon developers are basically impossible to get rid of unless you can point to something like the Trade Secrets Act to get them fired. Now, to fire, you need to bring either a legal or civil suit against them to get rid of them, and you have to have proper documentation and give this documentation over to, there's an office, an employee, basically the Labor Department in the United States is the equivalent. You have to file that away, hey, these guys were fired for this reason explicitly, here you go, and you have to give proof and valid reason, otherwise they can sue the shit out of you. So if you're an employer and you fire somebody, if you don't have proof and you wrongfully terminate that employee, it's very easy for the employee to sue the company if they don't file the proof. So Mr. Choi, remember this, them asking him to take his server down? Back sometime in early 2021, he's asked to take the servers down and agrees. That is why they fired him. So Mr. Choi was fired under the Trade Secrets Act, and they have a pending legal case against him. They filed a legal case in order to fire him because he, in my opinion, they fired him because he wanted to leave, and because they had evidence that the server was still up, and they probably already knew about it. This is all just opinion and kind of conjecture on my part, but in my opinion, it seems like they found out he was going to leave and start a competitor, right? They were going to leave, he was going to leave. They already decided to scrap P3, but he wanted to take the idea and run with it. And it's kind of made clear because they don't file for any kind of trademark or copyright until February of 20, like literally 2 years later. So it's kind of sus, right? But they fire him because he didn't shut that server down. But this also means that he has a pending Trade Secrets Act case, which is very important for IronMace and very important for him later. So some other important facts is that Korea has kind of a long history of corporate espionage, and it's not just internally or not just externally. They have a long history with China, North Korea, obviously, and other countries spying on them, and through a lot of technology companies. It's very common for a lot of corporate espionage to happen over there, but it also happens internally, so much so that I think it was in 2018 or 16, they formed this Trade Secrets Act. It came about because everybody was spying on each other. All the corporations were spying on each other. They were leaking in trade secrets. They were leaking information on other people's projects. And since companies like Samsung and Nexon and everybody else are so connected to the government, they basically codified that if you steal from a corporation, the corporation can basically throw you in jail or sue the shit out of you, bring down as harsh a punishments as they possibly can. And they left this law, this Trade Secrets Act, very vague, very, very vague, and they did so intentionally. Basically, if a company doesn't like you, and you do anything that might be construed as harmful to the company, they could use this Trade Secrets Act to fire you, to get rid of you, to sue you. I mean, they put a lien on Mr. Choi's house. That's how crazy this is. There's a lien on Mr. Choi's house. There was a lien on his bank accounts. According to the Discord post, there was a lien on his house, lien on his bank accounts, lien on his car. Like, they are trying to ruin Mr. Choi's life. And they're doing all of it under the Trade Secrets Act. Which brings me to the fact that Nexon is very heavily, along with a lot of other large corporations, very heavily connected to the Korean government. A lot of companies are. Samsung, namely, is the biggest one because it's Samsung. But if you have a large company that's worth, billions of dollars in South Korea, you basically have an in. Because of your financial and economic power, you have an in with the government. Similar to America, large companies, but they're even more closely tied in Korea because they have a long history and tradition of corporatism, right? Corporatism is basically ingrained in their government. Very similar to the United States, but I don't want to make this political. Another thing to keep in mind is that Nexon is very heavily tied to Tencent. Super important for later. 2019, Tencent tried to buy majority shares of Nexon. They wanted to own MapleStory, and there's another game that's wildly popular in China. As the deal was going through, the owner of NXC, the corporation that owns Nexon, and several other companies, canceled the sale because their founder and the person who owns it right now got sick. And the family was making discussions of whether they want the company to be inherited or do they want to sell it off. They still don't know what they're going to do. This is a few years later, or 4 years later now at this point. They still don't really know what they want to do, according to Nexon and NXC. They're still trying to figure that out. But during those agreements, Tencent was awarded with exclusive publishing rights to all Nexon products in China. China is their largest market. So effectively, Tencent owns Nexon indirectly. Like if Tencent owns, it's something like 40 to 60% of all of their profits is coming from China, and Tencent owns exclusive rights to all of that. So they are very, very heavily in bed with each other, Tencent and Nexon. Uh, I would go as far to say that Tencent basically owns Nexon indirectly. What was traded for that, I have no idea. We don't really know because that deal. However, that happened was not. It's been made public, but the terms of that agreement have not been made public. Tencent was also planning to invest in IronMace, and specifically Dark and Darker. This is also super important for later. Tencent have actually backed out, as well as according to several news sources, all of the other investors from IronMace have all backed out. Any offer that was on the table is pulled out until these court cases are resolved. I'll go over some of my sources. So the Trade Secrets Act itself, there are very important articles with it. So we'll go over first Article 2-1J. So if you go under Article 2, it's the definitions of it. You have 2-1, and I'll go down to J. So this is the definitions. The terms used in this act shall be defined as followed, right? This is how they define the actual terms. 2-1 is the term act of unfair competition means any of the following acts. So this is how they describe anything in this law. It's massive and very loosely worded. But what I found specifically was Article J in 2-1/J. Any other acts of infringing on other persons' economic interests by using outcomes, etc., achieved by them through substantial investment or efforts for one's own business without permission, in manner contrary to fair commercial practices or competition order. And the term trade secret means information including production method, sales method, useful tactical or business information for business activities that is not known publicly if the subject of or is the subject of reasonable efforts to maintain its secrecy and has independent economic value. So what these two together, to me, because they are kind of loose, they don't really point to anything hyper specific. It's anything that you do while under the under the employment of another company can count as basically trade secrets, right? But what is important is that Mr. Choi, what this basically means is that anything that an employee does while under the employment of somebody else, if it gives them any knowledge, if they take that knowledge and go somewhere else and use it to turn a profit, or they sell that information, they're in violation of this act. Just plain and simple. Because they don't outline what this term, information, is. They say that it includes production methods, sales methods, useful technical or business information for business activities that is not publicly known or is the subject of reasonable efforts to maintain its secrecy. But this part, to me, rings the most true, because by the time that Dark and Darker was under development, P3 had already been announced. People had already seen P3. People already knew the premise of P3. Tarkov, it was Fantasy Tarkov. It was already expressed publicly. So how can IronMace be held accountable? As a company, how can IronMace be held accountable under the Trade Secrets Act? To me, it doesn't make sense. Mr. Choi, personally, yes. And I think that's where the diversion kind of comes from. The separation comes from, because there's two cases. There's one for IronMace, and there's one for Mr. Choi. Mr. Choi arguably did these things. IronMace, as a company, wasn't founded and didn't start development or on Dark and Darker until P3 was already announced. So the whole of Article 4. So yeah, right here. Whole of Article 4. A person whose business interest is injured or threatened by an act of unfair competition or violation of Article 2.3, so what I referenced earlier. And so who can file for TSA? The file for this is basically any person who was injured financially or publicly or whatever by any of the stuff mentioned in Article 2.3. And when a person files a request under paragraph 1, he or she may also request the following measures. Destruction of the goods. So this means that when they request TSA, they can have all of the goods, in this case digital information, destroyed, along with any promotional material. Removal of facilities, so they could get them kicked out of their building, and they can get rid of their domain name, so any kind of web presence they have, and any other measures necessary to prohibit or prevent an act of unfair competition, right? So they could basically just say, get rid of all of your files, get rid of your website and all of your social media stuff, and get rid of your facilities. To Mr. Choi. In my opinion, this applies to Mr. Choi himself. So I'll get more into why that is important, but in a summary, if Mr. Choi does lose his case under the TSA investigation, anything that Mr. Choi has worked on or given to IronMace will have to be destroyed. Like, completely. So they'll have to recode anything that he worked on or had any input on, which is probably a substantial amount of the game, because he was the basically second in command. He was the lead developer. Now, if you go down to 7.2, this is where things get really interesting, in my opinion, and what nobody seems to be talking about. So this goes into the actual investigation. How can this investigation be taken care of? How do you investigate and actually try a Trade Secrets Act case? Now, Article 7.2 says where the commissioner, the person leading the investigation of the Korean Intellectual Property Office, the mayor, governor, or the head of, I can't pronounce that, basically they're cyber crimes people, conducts the investigation under paragraph 1, he or she shall avoid overlapping investigations pursuant to Article 15 of the Framework Act of Administrative Investigations. Now, the Framework Act of Administrative Investigations basically says you can't have double jeopardy. And what I mean by double jeopardy is you can't try the same person or the same organization. Like, say I am a business owner and I'm getting under a lawsuit for something. They can't come after both me or my business. They have to come after one of us, either my business or myself. They have to pick or choose. And if they try both, it usually goes to whatever investigation was started first, right? So the second investigation in this case would be IronMace Studios. That's the investigation that came second. So if this, which is written into the part of the TSA, I'll go to the Article 15 of the Framework Act here in a minute, but if this is true, they can't file this TSA lawsuit against both. Any investigation that they're doing right now against IronMace, should they choose to pursue the investigation of Mr. Choi, puts Mr. Choi, since he is a founding member of IronMace Studios, in double jeopardy. So they can't sue both. It says so right here. It's in the Trade Secrets Act, as far as I know. And I have the exact article listed right here. So, Framework Act on Administrative Investigations. Article 15, restrictions on double investigation. The head of an administrative agency who has conducted a regular or occasional investigation pursuant to Article 7 shall not reinvestigate the same person with respect to the same matter. So unless they find something new, they cannot reinvestigate the same person. But they haven't even found anything yet. So the investigations are both still ongoing, and they don't really have any evidence. So there's a bunch of weird shenanigans that's going to have to be spoken out by lawyers in court. This is my opinion. I'm not a lawyer. This is just how I'm interpreting these laws. This basically says, these are all really long-winded. Legalese sucks. This basically says it's up to the administrative agency who they intend to conduct the investigation on. So in this case, whoever's administering the investigation figures out who has precedent, which case has precedent. This is kind of ambiguous as to who gets to choose. It's either the investigating agency, so like the police, the cybercrimes division, the mayor, whoever's doing the investigation, or the people pressing the case, so in this case, Nexon. This term isn't really spoken about in this. It's all kind of loose.
which is surprising considering Korean law uses the letter of the law so strictly. So this one says this is basically just going over who can request information. So what these 3 articles are saying is you can't have double jeopardy. You can't sue somebody for the same thing twice under this law. In which case they're doing to Mr. Choi, because he's both an owner of IronMace and he's the person that they're already suing and already successfully fired under the same exact clause. So one of those 2 is probably going to fail, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But here's my opinion. The DMCA doesn't hold any water, in my opinion. And why? Because of this. If you look at the information that IronMace has provided, so if you look at I'll actually look at the DMCA. So if you look at the actual DMCA from Arnold and Porter, the people that Nexon used to deliver the DMCA to both Valve and Nexon, they go over a list, but they cite as their reasons project code, P3 codes, and this is where they go over their copyrights. So they've copyrighted their code, they've copyrighted audio-visual game material from P3, which is canceled. They are trying to copyright playtest, P3 playtest, and audio-visual material and spoken commentary registered to it. They're trying to copyright the character, Cleric, with 2D artwork, Ranger with 2D artwork, Barbarian with 2D artwork, character Tanker, 2D artwork, Thief, Wizard, and all of the artwork associated with all of it. So they're trying to register these classes and the artwork. If these go through, I don't care about the playtest with the audiovisual material. What I care about is these. If they are able to copyright this art style and the class for character, Ranger, Barbarian, Tanker. I don't really care about Tanker because just call it what it is. It's a fighter. And Thief and Wizard, but they also add Rogue and Fighter to that. If they're able to copyright these classes, it's kind of game over for a lot of people. But I'll get into that a little bit. But in my opinion, I don't think that's likely. Wizards of the Coast already tried to do this. And they failed hard. They tried to do all of this exact same stuff. And it's Wizards of the Coast. Like, they have an ironclad. Their legal team is like it's like Disney. You just can't do stuff like this. You can't copyright art styles. You can't copyright, like, audio styles. You can't copyright classes. You can't do that. You can copyright a piece of artwork. You can copyright a character name sometimes. If it's like super unique, you can. You can copyright your actual source code, like this one can probably hold. But if they expect this copyright to cover individual lines of code, no. This covers the code as in its entirety. And if it deviates in any significant way between the Dark and Darker and P3, if there's a significant difference to where they look like different programs, if you don't have any of the images and all that stuff, but if they just look like different programs, this copyright doesn't hold any water. This one right here, this one will, because it's audiovisual game material, so the P3 project itself might hold water because they're going to look at it as a piece of artwork in its entirety, but not individual pieces. Again, this is all in its entirety. The P3 playtest, and then these 5, in my opinion, there's no way in hell that they're going to be able to copyright the character for Wizard and any associated 2D artwork. You just can't. You can't do that stuff. You could copyright this artwork itself, so it might pass based on the artwork alone. But if they get the copyright to the Cleric, Ranger, Barbarian, Tanker, Thief, Wizard, and by proxy Fighter and Rogue, like, a lot of people are screwed. But in my opinion, none of this holds water, and it's also not why Nexon has put this forward. This is all a big smokescreen. Same thing with this right here. This list of files, this giant list of 1,000 files. So below is a list of resource file names that are identical. So this is what the police gave Nexon in their investigation. Below is a list of resource file names that are identical in Dark and Darker and the P3 game. So they're claiming that this list of files right here is over 1,000 files, and it's all identical to what is in both Dark and Darker and P3. This is their proof. This is their smoking gun that Dark and Darker stole a bunch of assets and code. The problem with this starts to fall apart immediately. If you look at this, Bones, pile 1, Bones, pile 2, Blockout, Step Slope Centered, Blockout, 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 Blockout. Not only are these generic names, but if you look at them and then you compare them to what IronMace gave us, comparison of resource file names between P3 game and Dark and Darker. If you start comparing these, there is how many? 1,033 files that they have compared. If you look at all of these assets, they have these funny little links next to them. Like, let's go back up to the blockout ones at the very top. All of those blockout assets that they said were proprietary to P3, this is a plugin that you can install in Unreal Engine for free that I have, and it helps you block out levels. And by block out, I mean it's level prototyping stuff. And this is like more than 100 of the files, I think, that they provided as evidence of theft. Yeah, it's like 136 of the files are just come from that one plugin. And then if you look at Fantasy Dungeon, right here, boom, Fantasy Dungeons. Does this look familiar? Do these assets look familiar? Yeah, because these are the assets that, if you've watched any of my live streams, I'm using this asset pack and 3 other asset packs to design my sewers dungeon. This is the same exact asset pack. Before Dark and Darker, I even knew what Dark and Darker was. This is the asset pack I wanted to use for my sewers. There's 3 of them. So I'm using this one and another paid and a free one. But these are the same exact walls. And these are the same exact walls that are in Dark and Darker. Nexon doesn't own these. And if Nexon does own these, why are they up for sale on the... One of 2 things. Either Nexon owns these, and these are proprietary to Nexon, and somebody found them and put them up for sale on Unreal Marketplace, in which case Unreal Marketplace is at fault for this, as well as the person who initially stole them, which kind of gets rid of that whole aspect, at least for these files. But let's continue. So Fantasy Dungeon 2, again. Where have I seen these before? Where did these pots come from? Where did these skull piles come from? These green glowy things. Where did like every single part of these pillars, like this is just all assets that are in Dark and Darker that are available for purchase for $129 on the Unreal Marketplace. It's just bogus. And if you go through literally everything that IronMace provided, and they compare right here, every single name for name. If you compare those to what Nexon put, look, blockout, concrete, candle, all of this stuff comes from Marketplace, plugins and asset packs. Let's go through another one, just for shits and giggles. So this GamesLift server SDK is the file for Amazon. It's the integration to the cloud servers that they're using to host their game. This is what I was planning on using. I was planning on using either Amazon GameLift or the Microsoft equivalent. It's just like literally the best and easiest way to do it. Can be a little pricey, but it's also super quick. Relatively quick. But yeah, this is just helps them connect the engine and client to the server, so that they run on AWS. So it's just this whole section D is all complete bullshit. And their copyright stuff for the images and classes looks strikingly similar. Yeah, here we go. Similarities, the game design. Here's the stuff that they're trying to copyright. So, P3, Dark and Darker. P3, Dark and Darker. P3, Dark and Darker. You know, here's the cleric. Here's the fighter. Here's the wizard. The reason why these look so similar is because the person who made these, the concept artist who actually created this artwork, left Nexon and recreated all of this stuff for IronMace, for Dark and Darker. The concept artist left. Nexon is trying to copyright this person, the artist's art style. And that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to copyright this guy's art style and have it associated with the character Ranger. So anybody who uses a similar art style and associates it with the class the Ranger will be in breach of copyright that Nexon owns, if that copyright is successful. Anybody who uses the class Ranger might be in breach of copyright. Might. That's kind of questionable. But if you use any kind of artwork that is similar and say that this is a Ranger, could be any kind of resemblance. If you use that has a bow and arrow, like, this is generic Ranger stuff. So if you say, if I drew a picture of a Ranger, and if I could draw this good, if I drew a picture of a Ranger and titled it The Ranger, I would be in breach of copyright. Because they're trying to copyright this guy's art and the class. They don't even own this guy's art, like they own the rights to this picture, but they don't own this guy's entire art style. It's completely ridiculous, and that's why I don't think that this holds water. Because the same artist did both of these. You can't copyright a person's art style. It doesn't work like that, especially when they're no longer in your employment. Sorry, I'm getting a little heated by this, but this has very wide implications. In my opinion, Nexon is pursuing legal cases against both IronMace and Mr. Choi under the TSA. I kind of went over that already. If you look through all of their filings, their legal filings, and their internal memos, everything mentions the term trade secret specifically. It's in the DMCA, I think, like 12 times. In my opinion, the DMCA doesn't really hold any water to begin with. I think they're doing it as a stall tactic to keep IronMace from being able to raise funds for future legal cases. I think they know it's probably going to fail. But that's not the point. They want to draw that out for as long as possible and prevent IronMace from possibly collecting upwards of $100 million would greatly benefit IronMace in their upcoming legal battles. So they're just trying to prevent IronMace from getting money. I don't think the DMCA is something to worry about. I think if the U.S. court system is idiotic and they happen to get whoever files and looks over their copyright claim, whoever looks that over, if they're idiots and they approve this copyright claim, it's going to change a lot of things for gaming. But I do think that Wizards of the Coast will immediately contend those copyright claims, at least the important parts. Wizards of the Coast will sue the shit out of Nexon if Nexon ever tries to press their copyright claim against anybody. Because if they don't, and nobody defends the case to use that copyright and argue that it's public domain, if they don't argue that it's public domain or fair use, Nexon will just get away with it. So, and there's already so many mentions of the term Ranger with images that look almost exactly like the ones that they have in every single edition of Dungeons and Dragons and any other high fantasy setting, that there's no way in hell somebody doesn't sue and have that portion of the DMCA taken down. And in which case, IronMace wins the rest of it because they're not using P3 audiovisual information at all. The files aren't even the same. So they didn't technically steal anything. They basically took a bunch of marketplace assets and then rewrote the code and made their own game. They used the same marketplace assets because they already knew they liked them. They already knew how to use them. It was quick, easy. That part of it holds no water at all, in my opinion. But as I kind of said, if the copyrights for those classes do go through, there's a lot of fucked up shit that's going to happen. Now, I'll get into what happens if, people start losing. So if Nexon loses the copyright case, which they probably will, but if they lose the Trade Secrets Act cases, either one against Choi or IronMace, it's going to have some pretty big implications across AAA gaming. Because essentially what that means is that development teams can walk out on their company and start their own game after already working on it and getting an idea of how to do it
with other employers, right? So a development team working on WoW 2, whoever's working on the next WoW can say, actually, I don't like Blizzard anymore. See you later, and go restart WoW, but call it like World of Warcraft, and it'll just be okay. There's nothing that Blizzard can do about it. That's kind of what the AAA studios are saying. That's what Nexon specifically is saying might happen. Whether that is true or not, we don't know. But what I can almost assuredly say is that we're going to see, at least in the West, because Korea doesn't really have as many non-competes, they don't really need them as much because they're codified under Trade Secrets Act. But in the West, I can almost guarantee that we're going to start seeing even more non-compete contracts and even stricter non-compete contracts. And if states continue this trend of banning non-compete contracts, we could probably see AAA studios like EA and other US AAA studios moving to states that allow for non-competes, because they're going to want all of their devs to basically say, hey, you can never work on a project similar to one that you work on with our studio, or for at least like 3 to 5 years. There's going to be crazy, like this case is kind of shitty. Regardless of what happens, it's a lose-lose. It's a win for anybody who likes Dark and Darker if IronMace wins, but as for the industry as a whole, this is a huge lose-lose situation, because people are going to be in the West, and countries that allow for non-competes are going to start seeing, most likely start seeing some pretty harsh non-compete clauses come out of this, because they don't want a similar situation happening at their studio. If they scrap a project, they should know, like want to feel comfortable that the devs who were on that scrapped project don't bail and create it and make a bunch of money. They want the opportunity to go, hey, a similar game came out from this studio. We have this game in our back pocket that we were working on 4 years ago. Let's update it and release it now that we see that it can be successful, right? Because realistically, that's why companies scrap projects. Movie companies do that all the time. They get a script that they don't know if it'll work, but then, like Inception. Let's use Inception as an example. Maybe the script for Inception was sitting around on somebody's desk collecting dirt. They paid $2,000 for that idea and the script, however much they paid for it, but they didn't really think it would make any money. And then The Matrix comes out, and they're like, well, shit, a trippy sci-fi movie like this just broke box office records. We have that script of Inception laying around. Let's make it. Boom. Now Inception's out. That didn't actually happen, but that's how this stuff kind of works. They shelve these ideas and they keep them in a locker until later, and if something similar comes out that they had an idea for previously, or maybe even started development on previously and scrapped, they'll bring it back and they'll work on it again to try to ride that gravy train. That's why they don't want this stuff happening, because now Nexon knows that if they bring out P3, it probably won't do as well. They could have brought it out, not made as big of a fuss, and they could have brought it out and remade the whole thing, but that costs time, that costs money, and all that stuff. They might as well try to spend a little bit of money and get a huge payout. Talk about that in a second. First, yeah, regardless of outcome, investors are going to be more hesitant to fund smaller companies who that have any connection to other game studios at all. That's most likely going to be just how things operate. Like, I don't foresee Tencent throwing as much money at smaller investors that have anything to do with any other game studios for a while. I see harsher non-competes. That's basically it. But I also see some pretty devastating consequences for what happens if Nexon wins their copyright and it's approved, right? If they win that copyright case, the cease and desist holds, and they're approved for their copyrights, like I said earlier, it's kind of game over. Now, because if large gaming companies are allowed to copyright mechanics, classes, artwork, art styles, things like dark bricks and torch mechanics, like they mentioned in their cease and desist letter, developing games is going to become super difficult for everybody, but mostly indie studios. That's because all these larger companies like Nexon, EA,
Tencent, they're going to start filing copyrights for fucking everything. For everything. They're going to start filing copyrights. And indie game studios aren't going to be able to financially compete with that. So there's an example, the game Taxi basically copyrighted and patented the mechanic for driving a taxi around as a game, right? That, I think it was N64 game or Super Nintendo even. The Simpsons came out with a similar game except with different objectives. Taxi went after the Simpsons, and it held. And instead of just a Simpsons taxi game, they had to add a bunch of different. They had to completely change the game. It went from being a Simpsons taxi game to a Simpsons game with a small taxi mechanic that was nothing like their original vision. And if that stuff is allowed to continue, it hasn't really happened as much since that, because the game industry said, whoa, if we keep patenting and copywriting game mechanics, eventually nobody's going to be able to make any more new games without being sued. Because mechanics aren't new. You know, if you try to imagine if somebody said, if Dark Souls went and said, I'm going to patent action combat mechanics, and now you're never going to have any other game that has any kind, other than from the company that made Dark Souls, that can have a similar style combat mechanic. No, it's crazy. It's insane. So that's why I don't think that will hold water. But if it does, we're screwed. Like, gaming and indies are fucked. If the copyright holds and and they lose on the trade secrets, and Dark and Darker, if the copyright holds and trade secrets holds, Dark and Darker's dead. Just straight up. It's game over. Bad news bears. Game's dead. If copyright holds, trade secret holds, everybody's fucked. IronMace loses, Mr. Choi loses, gamers lose in general. If the copyright holds and trade secret loses, Dark and Darker can come out for sure. They're just going to have to completely revamp their art style and change the class names and change the mechanics. It'll delay development by a long time if that copyright holds. Luckily, I don't think that'll happen. That would still be sad news for everybody. I mean, Dark and Darker can still come out in some way, in some shape or form, which is rad, because that game freaking rules. But that's a dark time for gaming if those copyrights hold. If the copyright fails, this is the most likely scenario right here. Copyright fails, but Trade Secrets Act holds. It really depends on which Trade Secret Act case wins, right? Which one is pursued and which one wins, because there's two. If Nexon wins I'm going to call the Trade Secrets Act TSA. So if Nexon wins the TSA against Mr. Choi is fucked. He will most likely be fired from IronMace, and anything he brought with him from Nexon is going to have to be removed from D&D, or Dark and Darker. Anything that he worked on will also probably have to be removed. It'll most likely impact the vision, art style, and overall development. It'll all probably suffer, but the game can still come out. They might have to change a lot of stuff. They're going to have to talk with, depends on what Nexon wants and what the Korean government actually, whatever the outcome of the case will dictate what they have to change. Most likely they'll have to remove anything that Mr. Choi worked on. If Nexon wins the TSA suit against IronMace, game over. Game's dead. Game has to be, it has to. By the law of the TSA, anything that has to do with that suit has to be destroyed. Game over, Ted. Nexon killed DaD. If they win against IronMace, it's a straight up game over. And this is what I think they're preparing for. This is what I think they want to happen. However, Mr. Choi is part of IronMace. He's a founder of IronMace. He can, and to the best of my knowledge, he cannot be charged with as both IronMace and as Mr. Choi. He cannot be charged under himself, and he cannot be charged with IronMace. So they're going to have to pick, or the investigators are going to have to pick one of the two. The best of my knowledge is if it's up to the investigator, they usually side with whichever case was
implemented first. If nobody else from IronMace had anything to do with the violation of Trade Secrets Act, they have to go after Mr. Choi. In which case, Mr. Choi is fucked. Unfortunately, he's probably going to lose his home. He's probably going to lose his car. He's probably going to lose a lot of money. He might even see some jail time. And D&D will have to be changed significantly. Most likely will have to be changed significantly. That is probably the most likely outcome. Is that, unfortunately, Mr. Choi, you fucked. But D&D will still come out, so everybody who likes D&D will be happy. IronMace will still be around. Nexon wins both against Mr. Choi and IronMace. Highly unlikely, in my opinion. But if somehow that comes to fruition, game's dead and Mr. Choi's fucked. Anything related to Dark and Darker will have to be destroyed, and Mr. Choi is fucked hardcore. But like I said, it's pretty clearly outlined in Article 7 that you can't have like a double jeopardy situation where one person is being tried in both circumstances. And the only way that IronMace can actually be charged at all with this is because of Mr. Choi's employment. That's really the only way that the case against IronMace holds water. So, yeah, I don't think that happens. I don't think they win both. I don't even think both go to trial. I think one of them will be thrown out before that even happens. Yeah, so like I say here, one possible outcome from them filing 2 TSA suits against Mr. Choi and IronMace is that it could lead to them losing one or the other on the grounds of double jeopardy. So here, there's 2 likely scenarios. Mr. Choi's fucked, and Nexon and IronMace settle. In this case, there's a very strong argument for this. Nexon and IronMace come to an agreement. Now, in this case, Nexon most likely owns a significant portion of Dark and Darker, and all profits and proceeds therefrom, and they get paid to literally do nothing. That's their entire goal. I think that right there is their entire goal for this. I think they want to make sure that IronMace, the DMCA is a red herring to make sure that IronMace doesn't have any money to prevent them from getting sued in the TSA cases. The less money they have to fight the TSA cases, the higher likelihood that Mr. Choi or IronMace gets fucked with the TSA case, and the higher likelihood of IronMace settling. Now, what happens to Dark and Darker in that case? Portion of the proceeds most likely have to go to Nexon. What I'm worried about is them having to give up like active shares, owning shares of Dark and Darker, to where Nexon has some kind of say on what the development looks like. Sorry, my voice is kind of going out. Now, depending on what happens, Nexon might go, okay, we want 40% of the company and we want 50-50 say on further development. Because now the development of Dark and Darker directly reflects their ability to make profit off of something that they're legally obligated to make profit off of. If they have a say in development, everybody knows what Nexon will do to Dark and Darker. It also gives Tencent a say in how Dark and Darker operates. So Dark and Darker will probably get monetized into the fucking ground. And this is, in my opinion, the most likely scenario. And if we remember back, Nexon owns effectively, or Tencent owns effectively all of the Chinese profits from Nexon. Tencent owns the largest portion of profits from Nexon. Tencent is also one of the largest investors that was going to back Dark and Darker. So, in my opinion, therefore, Tencent is involved with both of them. In my opinion, I think this right here, the settlement, is the most likely scenario because Tencent gets an in to both Nexon and IronMace literally without doing anything. They don't pay $1, they don't pay a dime, they don't have to lift a finger. All they have to do is advise Nexon to sue the shit out of IronMace and try to get a settlement, because then they get part of the pie from Dark and Darker, and they are also more deeply embedded with Nexon.
Unfortunately, I think that we're probably going to see some weird hybrid Nexon IronMace dark version of Dark and Darker by the time the game actually comes out. Now, if by some miracle Nexon loses the DMCA, and because they're trying to do double jeopardy and they get greedy and they sue both IronMace and Mr. Choi and push their copyright claims, if they lose everything, IronMace is going to bend Nexon over. They could file a massive countersuit against Nexon. Dark and Darker comes out as intended. Nothing really bad happens to IronMace. Nothing bad happens to Dark and Darker. And IronMace sues the ever-living shit out of Nexon. And they probably get a massive round of funding, probably from Tencent or somebody similar. So that would be a great day for the dudes at IronMace, and that's kind of what I'm hoping for. This is my most desired outcome, would be Nexon just getting pantsed and IronMace walking away with an extra $10 to $20 million because Nexon fucked around and found out. That would make me laugh and smile so much. Unfortunately, the bad news is that I think IronMace and Nexon are going to come to an agreement here probably pretty shortly. We should have more news on the Discord in the next day, according to one of the founders of IronMace. But yeah, that's about it. I mean, this is a long video, but this is a crazy topic that I've done a lot of research on. So, yeah, pretty nutty. If I haven't said this yet, like, subscribe. I think it took me like 3 days to write all this stuff down and to confirm all of the research I was doing. I'm going to try to get a link to all of this. I have my sources all listed here. I have a lot of information that I can link. I'll try to get a Google Doc up as well. But yeah, thanks. Like, subscribe, follow me for more. If Dark and Darker has a playtest soon, or if it comes out, I'm going to be playing the shit out of it and writing guides and trying to give my opinion on the game. I love it. I plan on doing build guides. I plan on doing live streams on YouTube. Like, it's going to be the game I play. If I'm not developing my own game, I'm going to be playing Dark and Darker, the living shit out of Dark and Darker. But yeah, thanks, dudes. Like, subscribe. Go hit me up on Patreon. I have a link to my Patreon below. Yeah, thanks again. Have a good day.